So, welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy, and I'll serve as a host for today's seminar. Thrilled to have a standing room only crowd here in Rubenstein, and equally happy to have our friends and alumni and colleagues joining us on Zoom. Most importantly, I'm thrilled to have with us today our old friend Heather Boushey. Heather is a senior research fellow at the Reimagining the Economy project here at the Harvard Kennedy School. She served in the Biden administration as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. She co-founded and served as the president and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her last book, and we'll hear more in a moment about her current book project, but her last book, Unbound, How Economic Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It, was on the Financial Times list of best economics books of 2019. Now, last year, when she was visiting us in residence, she joined us a number of times here as an attendee and as a questioner in the Energy Policy Seminar. And so it's great as she's working on this new project that she's able to join us here today to present this work. Heather, welcome back to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you. How's it on? Okay, great. So I am going to tell you a little bit about what is going to be in chapter 2 of the book that I'm working on. I just put that chapter kind of to bed, first solid draft down on Wednesday. So if my comments are a little mishmashy, it's because I'm still thinking them through. And this is the first time I've actually given this talk in this forum. So I'm excited to do that. But I also want to try to leave a lot of time for questions, because what would be most helpful for me would be feedback. Because I'm going to try to convince you of something that, I don't know, some of you might already agree with. Some of you may be just like, no, I've had a couple of conversations already this morning, like, no, I want to argue with you about your perspective. So I really want to hear all of those thoughts and feedback. I look forward to that part of the conversation. What I'm working on in terms of my book is I'm writing up what I'm thinking of as my economic vision for the next, for 2028, 2029, for after what we're doing now. And I'm focusing on what we learned over the Biden years and before, what we learned, what we did, what we learned, and where we should go from here. So it really is forward looking. And obviously, there's going to be a lot to think about in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I always think of the Inflation Reduction Act alongside of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act. They were designed together. They were implemented together. And I was the chief economist for the President's Invest in America cabinet for the past 2 years of the administration, which was really responsible for implementing those laws. My role was to go out and talk to people about it and to help understand the economics behind it. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you about is like, what were the economics behind it? What worked, what didn't, and how do we think about what that means moving forward? So I'm going to tell you about some places that I visited. I want to give you a little bit of the economic theory of the case. I want to talk about some of the implications and then get to questions moving forward. All of this starts with what I think of as the prime job of an economic policymaker such as myself. I've spent my entire career in Washington, D.C., advising people on the Hill, advising presidents and presidential candidates. And from where I sit, the number one job in our democracy for economic policymakers is how to make sure that our policies build and support a strong middle class. And by that, I mean it in sort of my shorthand definition of people who work for a living. So those folks, the vast majority of Americans earn the vast majority of their income from holding down a job, mostly disproportionately in the private sector. Where are those jobs coming from? How does it create that economic security? How does it create communities that can thrive? That's what policymakers are delivering, are supposed to be delivering, in my view. And so that's the set of questions that I'm bringing to these energy questions today. Okay, so let me go to my first slide. So I'm arguing that there are when it comes to energy, there are 3 ways to approach the clean energy challenge. And I'm starting today's talk today with the assumption that people are in this room because we care about energy, because people believe that climate change is a thing that we need to address. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the talk going over those kinds of basics, but assuming that we want to move to a clean energy economy, I see us at a crossroads with three different paths ahead of us. So one is to, in terms of energy policy, we could double down on domestically produced fossil-based energy. It's what this administration is currently doing right now. That's one way to meet our energy needs as a country for our national and economic security needs. Another would be to think about how we lower greenhouse gas emissions, so really prioritizing the environment through policies that focus on lowering emissions, but without really thinking at all about where energy is produced. Thinking about demand side policies, thinking about we've got to get emissions down for the health and well-being of us all. But the way I think about this question is actually starting from this question of how do we think about energy as a national and economic security question? I was trained mostly as a labor and macroeconomist. And so when I think about energy, I'm often thinking, okay, 20 years down the road, if we either do number one or two, where does that leave our industries in the United States? Where are we competitive? Energy is in everything. It's such a foundational technology, and it's so important for national security. If we're thinking we can rely on old technologies, or if we're not really thinking about how we need to develop the new technologies, where does that leave us in terms of our economic strength and the strength of our communities and the kinds of jobs we're creating in communities all across the country? Those are the questions that I think we need to start here, that I start here with thinking about energy. How do we make sure that it's fostering strong, equitable economic growth 20 years from now? And importantly, the grim side of that question is what will happen if we are not leading in inventing and producing clean energy technologies today and into the future? So that's the starter set of questions. Now I want to go, so in my role as a chief economist for the Invest in America cabinet, I had the opportunity to visit 19 places across the country in 2024. I often tell, depending on the audience, I made it to platinum on United on just domestic travel, which is quite frankly a massive feat. You should try it sometime. You'd spend a lot of time in airports. But one of the trips I took, and actually the very first trip I took, I went to Washington State. I am from just north of Seattle. And one of the things that we had talked about in the White House is that those of us who worked there were from all over the country. And I think we were having this conversation actually right after the IRA passed, but before Thanksgiving, when a lot of people were thinking about going home. And how we were probably the best messengers on what we were doing was those deputies, those of us sort of at the junior level who were working on these policies. And so when I had the opportunity to travel, I decided I would go to my home state first because I know it, I understand, the economics of it. But where I actually went was not the West Coast, which is where I'm from, but I went across the mountains to a place I'd never been in Moses Lake, Washington. And this is a photo that I took on the ride over with my colleague, Alex Yaquez, who worked at the National Economic Council, primarily on our among other things, our clean industrial economic strategy. And while he was telling me about all the businesses that we were going to visit, I was obsessed with taking pictures of the windmills I'm sorry, wind turbines, not windmills, wind turbines, that I was seeing on the landscape as we crossed the mountains to the east of Washington State. So we were going to Moses Lake, Washington. And Moses Lake is, as you can see, it's on the eastern side of Washington State. It is a part of Washington State that was where its economy was really made possible by a series of investments that were made in the 1930s and 40s. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt invested in building the Grand Coulee Dam, which is not on the map, but that's up there on the Columbia River above Moses Lake. They made it possible for this very arid part of the state, but that had very fertile soil, to become an agricultural powerhouse. So these sets of dams that were able to irrigate all this community. So this federal investment that came in that created both irrigation systems that allowed the land to be more useful, but also really importantly created clean hydropower that's powered Washington State that actually was quite cheap. By the time we get to fast forward, I'm going to talk about some of the industries there. It was this long-time investment in these dams and then upgrading these dams that led to the strength of this community. So there's a picture of the Grand Coulee Dam, and the county, Grant County, which is where Moses Lake is in, is the top agriculture producing county in Washington state. And that is where most of the jobs currently come from in the state. But the people who live in Moses Lake, Washington, had another set of ideas about where they could find their growth in that community. And this is a timeline. I'll show a couple of these, but in the early 1980s, the Union Carbide Corporation came in, and they made use of the silica in the region. Now I'm revealing like the technology issues here, but they really took advantage of the cheap power available in that part of the country to commission a factory that would produce polysilicon, which by 2002 became the first factory dedicated to supplying polysilicon specifically to the solar industry. And it ended up becoming by in the early 2000s, 2022, it had 300 employees. This factory called REC Silicon, which was the largest employer and the largest taxpayer in Grant County. Fast forward to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that made a lot of investments in clean energy. It had 90 billion in that law. That was the 2009 Recovery Act coming out of the Great Recession. Had all these different incentives for making supply side and demand sides investments in clean energy. And REC Silicon took advantage of that. They got $154 million federal, not but grant through the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which led to a $1.7 billion expansion of their Moses Lake facility and ramped up their number of employees to a whopping 900 people. But in this community, which is a small rural community, this is a big employer in this part of the state. So this is really emblematic of the federal government making these long-term investments in cheap energy and in clean energy in this particular case through the dams and through the hydropower that was put in place. The community also making a series of investments. I'm not going to go through all that, but making it possible for this factory to succeed. And in 2012, Jay Inslee ran for president of Washington State. And one of the things that happened in this community was that the folks that lived there, they'd been going through some, booms and busts with their factory. But the folks that lived there realized that given the silane gas that they have and a bunch of other things connected to that particular place, they had the possibility to make this part of the country into a place where you could have battery factories. And so the Economic Development Agency, the Port of Moses Lake, under the leadership of a man named Richard Hanauer, they worked with folks in the community to put together a plan to bring battery production to this part of the country. And although this has long been a Republican-leaning part of the state, part of the country, part of Washington State, they saw that Jay Inslee's approach to clean energy could provide this anchor for developing out their ability to have these industries. So I'm trying to weave all this very complex story together in a short period of time, but to connect the dots between how the federal government was thinking about clean energy policy, the American Recovery Act, providing that vision and that leadership and that support, the local community coming together to help make use of those supports, and being able to provide this really important product, but this economic development strategy. So when you fast forward to where we were when President Biden was running for office and thinking about his economic agenda and what we wanted to put together, there was a lot of learning from places like this all across the country, and what we learned from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, as well as some policy failures. And I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to talk first about some of the things we learned and where we needed to go. So one of the core ideas that motivated the economic agenda of the Biden administration was a simple idea that what we make in America and how we make it matters. That for communities like Moses Lake, for communities all across the country, they're thinking about what their economic development strategy is. The price of energy, that availability is core to that economic development strategy. And for years across the United States, we have been very lucky. For years, when I say years here, I mean for the last like 150 years, the United States has always been a country that has had access to abundant energy that has made it possible for us to have cheap and affordable energy supplies. So we were an early leader in the United States. And I know that I'm speaking on some of these topics to people that know far more than me. So feel free to fact check me later. But my understanding of this history is that, in the mid to late 1800s, by the early 1900s, we were a global leader in coal production, leading around the world. Discovered oil, first in Pennsylvania, then Texas, Oklahoma, and Alaska. We became leaders, of course, in the past few decades in hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling. All of this, really making use of the natural resources across the country and the abundance of energy to make us a leader in something that actually was foundational to our national and economic security. So this reliable, high quality energy at competitive prices, made it possible for us to play our part, for example, in World War II, where 80% of Allied fuel needs was provided by the United States, a really important national security moment in history that we played, that then played a part in where the United States went moving forward. Um, and you can see some of these national security issues all the way up through what happened in recent years when Russia invaded the Ukraine and the United States was able to both release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and other ways to use our resources to help solve this global crisis. So the abundance of energy made it possible for us to have a national economic strategy in many ways that is no longer going to be possible moving forward if we believe that climate change is real. So I'm going to take that as a given for the moment. But if we believe that the future will need to depend in large part on clean energy technologies, which are by and large manufactured. Now, certainly, there are place-specific aspects of clean energy technologies where you have wind or solar, but a lot of the technology relies on high-tech, advanced manufacturing. This is about innovation, less about just the natural resources that you have, especially for a country like the United States and many of our economic competitors. If you think about where we are moving forward, that path is going to be very different than where we came from. So this question of what we make in America and how energy fits into our vision of our economic future is going to become much more imperative. So as we were thinking about this vision in the Biden administration, we laid out a series of sectors where we believed that the United States needed to lead and we had the capacity to lead. And I think that these are still the right three sectors, but this is something that we should be debating and be talking about. We made a decision that was very bipartisan that high technology, in particular semiconductors, needed to be one of those sectors, national security reasons, economic security reasons. We made a decision that care industries should be one of those sectors, both elder care, but in really importantly, early childhood and care issues, where market failures have meant that we've not made the investments that we needed to make, actually very similar to the failure of markets in semiconductors, and I would also argue energy. You see those same kinds of market failures in the care sector. That's an area where we need to be leading, and we're not. And then clean energy, where if we don't think about the fact that the path forward for the United States is shifting because of climate change, because of the way that we have relied on these natural resources is shifting, we need to think about this as a sector that we need to care about. So that was one of the sort of the arguments. The second is that in many ways, we are now so dependent, many of our communities across the country are dependent on the fossil-based industries. This is a place where in my notes, I need to work on the transition. So I'm just sort of acknowledging that. Something I need to note for my chapter. I'm not going to write that down, but it'll be on the recording. So as we are looking at where we need to go forward, one of the things that we have to reckon with is that there are communities all over the country that are in various ways heavily reliant on fossil fuel industries, either because they're reliant on mining and extraction and production and processing of fossil fuels, or because they're reliant on other other industries that use fossil fuels. They're making internal combustion engine vehicles, for example, or airplanes, and maybe we'll change how we do those in the future, or something like that. By my count, there is about $1.9 trillion tied up in extraction and processing of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels power 80% of US primary energy consumption. And there are about 700,000 workers directly employed in extraction and processing of fossil fuels. But there are, of course, a lot of other workers that are indirectly employed in those sectors. And we know what the local risks are to abandoning industries that are concentrated in places. We've just lived through this, and I would argue it's had a very significant effect. I wouldn't just argue it, many people argue that it's had a very significant effect on our politics and our economics. And that's, of course, the China shock, where in 2001, we allowed China to enter the World Trade Organization. And over that time period after they entered, that led to the loss of 1 million manufacturing jobs, 2.4 million jobs overall. And there's various ways to think about that issue. One is, should we be having a conversation about prioritizing manufacturing or making it a trade conversation? All of that's important. But what I want to focus on is that if you agree with me that one of the key things that economic advisors to a president need to have front of mind is, what is the strength of America's middle class? Do people in communities all across the country have access to the kinds of jobs, which means that they have to have access to private industries that can be competitive and can provide those kinds of jobs? Then how we got here is a little bit less like that's a really important research question. We need to figure that out, like why we have things like the China shock. But where we go moving forward and how we adapt to that is going to be imperative for the success of our economy. And I would argue that it affects our politics. It also affects our national security in a variety of ways. So you think about a place like Boone County. Apologies, I did not write down what state that's in. I think it's West Virginia, but I don't know. I can fact check myself on that. But Boone County, where between 2012 and 2017, coal output decreased by 70%. And that led to county revenues decreasing by 38%, which of course led to school closures, cuts in services, and made the community in many ways so different than it had been before, and not those same kinds of resources. So how do we think about these sets of issues? And it comes down to, if you care about the middle class, this phrase, what we make and how we make it, is very important to local communities. It may not be important, for us thinking about the nation, we may not be thinking always, but that place-based is important for people who live in places. I would argue that this is exactly the kind of approach that we've seen China take over the past few decades, that they have taken this place-based economic approach that acknowledges that what they make domestically is actually very important to their national and economic security. That was the focus of the Made in China 2025 vision that was released in 2015, where they said, we want to lead in these particular sectors. It will be important for us to do so. It'll be important for our economic future, our national economic security. And of course, clean energy was a part of many of those sectors that they prioritized. It was about high tech. And I think what is interesting is that even back in 2015, they were putting high tech and clean energy in the same bucket, recognizing that the skills that you develop in high tech are going to help you in clean energy and vice versa. And if you're going to lead, you're going to want to lead in both. So this is really about thinking about what sectors are going to make you grow moving forward. Now, of course, China controls over 90% of several clean energy supply chains. I'm an economist. I just characterologically think that monopolies are bad. So that over 90% just always, oh, that's not good, right? Because we think that competition helps us be more productive, but it also means that they have choke points, and we're literally seeing them. I mean, right now, today, this weekend, they are able to negotiate with President Trump over tariffs because they invested for a long time in creating choke points. This is about national and economic security. And of course, I'm referring to the rare earth minerals that they have put some restrictions on exporting. And I don't, tariff policy changes so quick. I mean, just in the last hour, I don't know where it is now, and I didn't look this morning, so cannot comment on that. Before, and I want to just go to one slide before I go to I want to go to solar as an example and come back to REC Silicon. So When I first started taking economics, one of the very first things that so a little segue here, another rough transition. But when I first started taking economics and thinking about how you think about economic policy or economic growth, I was introduced to the idea that the economy is made up of three factors of production: capital, people, and the natural world. And that's what goes into anything, right? So very basic Econ 101. And this idea that we care about what we make and how we make it, um, to my mind, is very connected to the idea that we always need to, as economic policymakers, be thinking about how our three factors of production are or are not in balance. So I started thinking about this stool metaphor many years ago. It was actually during the financial crisis of 2008, because I would often think about how in 2008 we had allowed capital, we'd allowed finance to have too much control over our economy. We had deregulated certain sectors, created a housing bubble, and the economy was collapsing. I worked on Capitol Hill at that time. I was at the Joint Economic Committee, and as I was watching the economy collapse, it was clear that we'd really sort of made this stool really big and given all our attention here, and just hadn't focused enough on the people part of the equation. And now when I think of this, I often think of the natural world leg of our stool as rotting from the inside out because of climate change. And that's going to cause this stool to fall over just as much as the financial crisis did, but it's happening slower. Rot is kind of like it's corrosive in the various ways that I think that metaphor works. But that part of our role, as we're thinking about what we make and how we make it, is to make sure that we're balancing these three parts of the stool, that we're thinking about the natural world and people and capital. I'm going to come back to this in a couple of minutes. But I thought, but anyway, this was where it was in the slide deck. I want to go next to solar and back to China. One of the things that China has been able to do very well, actually, I'll just stay here for a second before I go, because you're all going to focus on that chart. I know how your minds work out there in the audience. Always focus on the charts. So when you think about the solar industry, the technology for the solar panels that we use today was demonstrated its first practical application in Bell Labs in 1954. And it was not until the early 2000s that the first, actually, I'm not going to, I don't want to go into all this history here, but there was, we invented this technology here in the United States, but over the period, particularly from the 1990s through to today, we allow the production of this to happen outside the United States. And I argue in an earlier chapter of the book, you'll have to read the whole book if you actually want to know what I argue in the earlier chapter, but I argue in chapter 1 that, one of the things that we, as economic policymakers, we embrace this idea that you could have placeless production, that it was okay that we could invent things here in the United States at places, universities, great minds can do all the inventing, but the actual production could happen anywhere in the world. And that didn't matter, and that was a fine way to be thinking about economic policy. And I think if it's not apparent already, I think that was it was a misguided approach to economic policy from the perspective of communities all across the country. Solar is a really good example of that. Something that the United States invented, something that I've already mentioned. REC Silicon in Moses Lake was producing polysilicon for a domestic industry back, they started producing the polysilicon in the 80s. They were producing this in the early 2000s. But yet, China made these very strategic investments in the solar industry that have allowed them since then to dominate that production. So I have a whole list here of all the different ways that China has made these investments. But what it comes down to is that they invested in the coordination and in addressing various market failures, large-scale subsidies, and then they also did promote internal domestic competition, so that by 2022, they had invested so much that they have 50 billion in solar solar PV capacity. Yeah, that's that. And they controlled greater than 80% of the supply chain, of key parts of the solar supply chain. They have the top 10 suppliers of PV equipment. And you can see that here, this growth from 2010 to 2022, and the big red here is China, down at 20 some odd percent in 2010, up to upwards of 80% as of 2022. And the United States share, which had been relatively high when REC Silicon was ramping up in the 2010s, is now quite small. So one of the things that happened, so as you saw that this process develop, this had direct implications for the Moses Lake community. So actually, that's not that yet. This had direct implications for the Moses Lake community. They were no, you know what? Sorry, my slides are in a different order, so I'm going to go on to this next thing. Yeah, I'm so sorry that you're the first audience for this, that the slides are not, but thank you for being such a gracious audience. So China's up here 2022, and then I wanted to I just put this in, at the last minute because this was such a great story that appeared in the New York Times recently, that China has now made this massive investment, 162 square miles of solar panels in the Tibetan Plateau. In 3 years, this is going to be 10 times the size of the island of Manhattan, this huge solar investment. While at the same time, our government has actually been paring back our investments. So pulling this solar story all the way up to a couple of weeks ago, we're actually seeing China continuing to dominate in this. And this is, of course, in the installation, while the United States is not making that same investment. This, of course, has over that time period, big implications for what happened in Moses Lake. So if you go back to the teens, where 80% of their output was exported to China's manufacturing facilities. So going back to here, where you can see that we are part of this supply chain. Moses Lake was part of that. They are exporting. They are part of that big exporting. There was a trade war during the first Trump administration. Sounds familiar. So there was this trade war. People in the industry begged the administration to make it easier for them to continue to export so that we could have this domestic industry. The president did not decide to do that. And so you see that by 2018, REC Silicon's exports are down 90%. And they ended up laying off most of their employees. And I'll come back to these last points a little bit later in the talk. But what was happening at the national level and the shift in vision, the shift in priorities across sectors had this very deep implications for this community, which I've already mentioned was the largest employer in Moses Lake. So went from being a big employer to a small employer. And of course, the confusion, because this was something where they had been relying on federal policy, and the back and forth, of course, creates this chaos for jobs and for the community. So one of the things I mentioned, I think at the beginning of the talk that I was going to comment on is that, so when you think about the various ways of approaching clean energy policy, I'm articulating some of the boots on the ground. What does it mean for actual firms that are trying to do the production to make the clean energy technologies so we can have solar panels? You can sort of trace this out in different kinds of industries. Of course, another different kind of policy that you can put in place is to put in place carbon pricing of some form or another, cap and trade or carbon taxes that can allow, discourage the use of technologies that increase emissions, but are setting aside these questions. And I will just pre-butt any questions on this. My own views are that we as economists, we love solutions that are one problem, one answer, because that's clear, right? It's clear what we're doing. We can understand all the trade-offs when we do that. I would argue, and I think it's probably clear to you by now, that this is not actually an easy problem because there are multiple aspects going on. This is about our national security. It's about our economic security. It's also about emissions. That's a lot of different things to be thinking about at once. If access to cheap energy is important for all of your industries and it's important for your role as a global superpower, having access to that becomes very important. Emissions are its own thing, which is also very complicated in its own set of ways. And as we think about the idea that we can solve this problem using pricing, that does solve the emissions problem, but it leaves the national and economic security questions to the side. And when I worked on the Hill at the JEC during the financial crisis in 2008, that was also the moment when the Waxman-Markey legislation failed. I did not write down in front of me the full title of that legislation. So Clean Energy Act, I think, of American Clean Energy Security Act of 2009. So when that piece of thank you, and thank you for all of your work on that. When that when that legislation failed, I remember it being, I was working on the Hill at the time, and I wasn't working on clean energy. I was working on the implications of the financial crisis and what it was meaning for our economy. And I was reflecting on it this morning as I was preparing and knowing who I was going to be talking to, and I remembered that at the time it was orthogonal to the economic crisis that we were facing. And I remember we were all like, of course this isn't gonna, I remember my boss just being like, this isn't gonna go anywhere. Like this is not gonna be the big thing. And maybe, history could have turned out a different way, but looking back for the book, as I was thinking about, what policies could fail, what could, like how we solve this problem, I was struck by how that moment was such a bad moment to be talking about putting a higher price on carbon. We were facing, we had unemployment of over 9% at the time. I mean, that was shockingly high. I mean, it would be years before the typical family recovered their net wealth out of the crisis. It would be years before employment got back. Millions of people whose lives were on a different trajectory because of the crisis. And then to have added costs and to have threatened industries. I mean, just looking back, it was like, it's crazy that it got as far as it did. So go team that made it go as far as it did. But I have a couple of quotes in the book that I thought I would put up from Lindsey Graham and Senator Graham and Senator McCaskill. Partially, I'm putting these up because neither of these are from what I would consider oil or fossil fuel places. And yet both of these quotes are very much about the fear of job losses that would come from the the Waxman-Markey bill, concerns about driving up energy costs. And there's another quote that he has about jobs, and Senator McCaskill talking about jobs and worried about being competitive. And so as we're thinking about how it is that we're going to solve this tripartite problem of emissions, national security, energy security, putting a price on emissions is an important tool, but it leaves all of the what I think are the interesting questions or the complicated questions. Those aren't going to go away. Even if you put a tax on something, somebody is going to have to deal with all of these other issues. And if there's one thing I'd like to leave you all with today, is that as future policymakers and maybe future economic policymakers, those are the questions that policymakers need to know the answers to. And so I think part of my call here is to get us all to focus more on the complicated questions of how you deal with the local economic development issues, how you deal with the actual changing of your economy. And the taxes are nice and important, but they leave all of the tough questions undone. Okay, I knew this would happen. I'm usually pretty good on keeping to time, but I'm gonna zoom through here. I have a nice little graphic here. One of the things I talked earlier about the leg of this stool rotting. At this moment, as we are thinking about our clean energy systems and we're thinking about the kinds of policies that we need, I think the best way to think about this stool is that the natural world leg is a Jenga game. I'm gonna work on better graphics for this, but that's a Jenga game there. And the thing about the Jenga game is that it acknowledges that any piece of that puzzle is a part of a larger system, that changing your energy system is not as easy as, it's not one thing, because energy is so embedded in the way that we power, the way that we cool our buildings, the way that we power transportation. It's so embedded in everything around us that the idea that there's going to be one policy solution, that it's going to be simple and easy, I think is kind of well, that's not just the reality of the situation. And what we do if we rely on a one solution system, like thinking that just one policy will solve it, is that we're really at risk of knocking over our stool and having the Jenga game. Really, the whole purpose of this talk was to show you what I think is the best slide here, which is that it's all just going to fall over. And the complexity of this to me is really brought home as I've watched the rise and whatever it is of Tesla over the past few years. So if you want to think about the complexity of how it is that you're going to build out clean energy industries, you can think about the complexities that a place like Moses Lake was facing, dealing with an international market, dealing with domestic production, policies that are shifting. You can think about it in terms of Tesla that set out to be the dominant producer of electric vehicles, which is a completely audacious idea, because it means that not only do you need to build a better car, but you need to build better systems so that people can drive those cars, right? You need to build out the electric vehicle charging network, because without that, nobody's going to buy your car. And that's going to require more money than any regular car producer could even imagine having to do, right? Because this is you're trying to make this really big leap to change the whole path dependency about how we buy and use cars. And of course, they were able to do that for a number of reasons. There were a number of very specific things that allowed Tesla to do the magical thing that it did to become the biggest producer of electric vehicles. They were able to do this because Musk could self-finance it, because Elon Musk had gotten so much money from the acquisition of PayPal. He had $100 million from that. They also got federal government help. They got a $465 million loan from the Loans Program Office. For all of you sort of older folks in the room, that was about the same size as the Solyndra loan. So just FYI, you can ask me about that in the Q&A if you want. But they from the same group, so they got the same loan that the Solyndra did. But they got a $465 million loan, and that loan and Musk's money. So this was not replicable, but the money was, or the money was not replicable, but this was. They were able to pay off the loan early, and they were able to use this loan to crowd in private capital. Panasonic, the amount of money that Panasonic was agreed to invest in their Gigafactory was a whopping $1.5 billion on the strength of what they were able to show in early years of production and all the different ways that they were able to create this market. As you look back at this case study, it really does show how difficult and how many things have to go right to be able to fix market failures in one sector. And then also how much can go wrong, and how it also then, you know, again, I'm an economist, I don't like monopolies. Like if our whole system is based on one, you know, multi-millionaire being able to have one factory and being able to dominate, that's not, and have like the systems for the electric vehicle charging network, that's not going to be good for competition in a future EV market. So as a policy matter, this isn't the best way to go about changing a system. It's a little off topic, but it is, I think, important to note. So all of this went into how we thought about what we wanted to do with the Inflation Reduction Act and the larger Invest in America agenda. So I want to just spend a couple of moments talking about some of the things that we did in the IRA. This, I might just end with this slide because this is rather cool. So on the day that, so in July of 2022, I was in CC Rouse's office. She was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I was standing there with Martha Gimbel. And we were talking about, actually, I was just CC and I were talking, and Martha came into the room. And actually, no, the three of us were talking. She was already there, but she was looking at her phone because Martha does that. And told CC and I that we needed to go to the Roosevelt room. And I was like, wait, what? And Martha was like, no, it's happening. She was like, it's happening. There's a deal. If you recall, there was this deal for the Inflation Reduction Act that passed the House in September of 2021. It got blown up in that December. And by July, I seriously had given up. I did not believe it would happen. June, I was still hopeful, but July, I was getting really grumpy about it. but it did happen. They took us into the Roosevelt Room, and this is a photo of the piece of paper that I was handed. That this was the deal that was made between Chuck Schumer and Senator Schumer and Leader Schumer and Senator Manchin. That allowed us to make all of these investments in clean energy. So at the time, it was a $369 billion in energy security, and then some money of that also from the IRS tax enforcement. Of course, we know now that that is probably much larger, probably closer to $1 trillion at that time, in the Biden years, because the tax credits were uncapped. So what we were able to do, and what I wanted to end on here is that this deal that we were able to do, the reason that it was so important that it was Joe Manchin that was making this deal is that the learnings that we had from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that we could use policies on the supply side and the demand side. We could give consumers tax credits to buy solar panels, for example. We could extend that to buying electric vehicles, as we did in the Inflation Reduction Act. We could solve some of the market failures in terms of coordination failures, building out an electric vehicle charging network, which actually happened through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We could make investments in high technology like we were doing through CHIPS. And we could do all of these supply side investments to just ramp up the kinds of loans like what Tesla and Solyndra got, that $465 billion. We ramped up that program. We made investments on the supply side from all the way from innovation through commercialization at scale. And we did this through a piece of legislation that was done in concert with a senator from West Virginia who was also committed to making sure that we supported the communities that may be left behind in this. So core parts of that legislation included encouraging all of this, the tax credits, the grants, and the loans. In various ways, we're supporting firms that use prevailing wages, that did community benefit agreements, that did project labor agreements, all of which were aimed at creating good jobs in places. A lot of technical assistance to help those economic development leaders in communities around the country find their place in this new clean energy supply chain. In my 19 visits, that's what I visited people in mostly red and purple places who were making these investments happen, just like REC Silicon and that community was doing, but all across the country. And let's see what slide's next. So by the end of it, we'd invested $1 trillion we'd crowded in $1 trillion in private sector investments all across the country, disproportionately going to lower income places. 80% of this went to places where the income in the United States is less than the national average. And it meant that places like Moses Lake, who had long ago made that battery plan that I told you about, where they said we could be a battery hub. By the time that Alex Yaquez and I visited in November of 2023, there was REC Silicon that was ramping back up and rebuilding their factory. There was Sila Industries that was also building up. And this is Group 14. These are making different components of a clean battery supply chain and using the silane glass offtake that's happening from the REC Silicon factory. So creating this hub. Now, I've spoken to them in the past couple of months, and they remain super excited and enthusiastic about what's happening in their community and its ability to create the kinds of jobs that can make this community thrive. I spent a whole day with these folks, and one of the things that just struck me, again, I'm from the Seattle area, in the suburbs outside of Seattle, and they knew that. So they're east of the mountains, and they had a little bit of like, you think that you're so great because you're from Seattle and we're Moses Lake, kind of, I could feel a little like in some of their remarks to me. And they were trying to sell me on how great their community was. And they were talking about how low the housing prices were and how great the schools were and how much they loved living there. And, talking to them and realizing that these people had been through busts and booms from this factory, and that one of the guys that was there had been had been with this factory for decades as it had grown and collapsed. And they were so committed to making sure that this place that they loved had a viable economic strategy and that they could see clean energy as being part and parcel to that because they had this long-standing hydropower that meant that whatever they were doing was already clean. So they were kind of double dipping on the clean side, and that they could be part of a sector that they knew was important to America's national and economic competitiveness moving forward. Even if, and we didn't talk politics because one never does that when you are visiting a place as a representative of the President of the United States, but even though I got the impression that they were not Democrats, they made it very clear that they understood that this was a model that could work for them, so long as it really did work for them. And we spent a lot of time actually visiting, this is a picture that we took of the Big Bend Community College. They clearly were spending a lot of time with them. They were really ramping up their ability to train kids, students, high school students and college and community college students in the community so that they could thrive. Of course, what's happened since then, this is just 2025 on the timeline. You don't need to read all the details, but a lot of it's places closing and cutbacks that have been made since the Trump administration came in office. As you all know, they've done these massive cuts to the clean energy investments. They have, they've done all sorts of things, but it has meant that a lot of changes have happened. REC Silicon did close its doors for a while. They've now been bought by their biggest, the biggest purchaser of their product. But one of these, I think Sila is still doing well. This one, 1D closed. At any rate, it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a challenging local story. I wanted to end on this one, which is actual investment in manufacturing projects fell by 15% in the second quarter of 2025. But I'd like to note that falling by 15% still makes Q2 of 2025 the biggest year in, really since, in quite a few years, and certainly way bigger than before the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. So all is not lost. I don't want to end on a grumpy note. But I think that the point that I do want to emphasize here is that thinking about the what and how of clean energy is actually very much part and parcel to thinking about how it is that we have a viable economic strategy for the country as a whole. It's imperative for our national and economic security. It's imperative that we understand that this is that this plays out in places. We need to think about what the local economic development angle is. And in my experience, in my travels, places are very excited for being able to be a part of what they see as future technologies that are going to allow them to grow and thrive. And so I saw a lot of on-the-ground support for the policies that we were doing, even if that didn't mean that those places ended up voting for Joe Biden. Most of the places that got the money from the Inflation Reduction Act did not vote for Joe Biden in 2020. They did not vote for Kamala Harris in 2024. I don't think, though, that means that thinking about clean energy as a local economic development strategy that needs to work hand in hand with the federal government is still not the right way to go, because any other way of thinking about it ignores the on-the-ground reality of just how complicated this is and how much it needs to be embedded in communities. And coming back to that main goal that I see economic policymakers needing to have front and center, thinking about this sector is going to be so important for the whether and how of the future of America's middle class, the future of the people who work for a living and work at private sector jobs. Whether or not we get this right will determine whether or not we have that kind of economic security for future generations.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions. As host, I'm going to take the first question.
So it'll be really hard.
So I'd like for you to explain for us a little bit about how we think about going from local place-based economic development to national security and economic security. So if I'm thinking from the standpoint of, say, Washington in 2029, which at the beginning of your remarks, it's part of what's motivating you with this work.
Yeah.
How do I think about what's the appropriate policy framework that will guide those kinds of local investments, how I make decisions and prioritize. Like I'm trying to think, do I want 10 Moses Lakes? Do I want 100 Moses Lakes? Do I say Moses Lake does this one suite of technology and I need 5 suites or 10 suites? I'm just, part of it is I understand place based and we get very local when we think about economic development. But if our overarching objective here is economic security and national security, how do I think about the sort of guiding principles at that top level that will then manifest in effective targeting, especially in a world where we're going to have scarcer resources in 29 than we did when we passed a bill in 22? What criteria should I have in mind that's going to help us allocate those scarce resources effectively in the policy design?
That's such a great question, and it gets right to the heart of what is hardest. I yeah, I often felt that again, and I said this in the remarks. I think you have to start by acknowledging that some of these really tough questions we don't have time to leave to chance, although we would love to, right? So part of it, I think part of the this is more for the audience, but part of the undercurrent of that question is that markets are wonderful things, right? If you could leave the development of clean energy industries to markets, you want to leave as much to the private sector to do what they can do and to use market forces as possible, because it's easier. You don't have to make all these decisions. Of course, we know that part of the problem is that we don't have a lot of time to solve our emissions problem. And so we don't have a lot of time on the climate side. But because we're behind the 8 ball and we've conceded a lot of these technologies, particularly to China, who's like, quite frankly, kicking our butt and doing a really great job, at what point do we decide we want to be in that game and we do want to compete for these, and which do we not want to? So I think the first thing that you need to do is to acknowledge what your goal is, right? I've had a lot of conversations with people like, well, Heather, solar's already gone. So it's gone. We really shouldn't focus on that. And I am inclined to think, well, that is that's entirely reasonable. Feels very different when you're talking about the wind turbines, right? Those are very big. It's a technology that's used in a variety of different sectors. It's a lot of steel. That could be clean steel. That feels like one we don't want to concede to other countries. And it's big. So you actually, for climate reasons, you don't want to be shipping turbines across the ocean. So that's one where maybe you don't want to concede. Maybe we can concede solar. Do you want to concede 90% of it to another country? That seems like a policy decision. Maybe 50%, maybe 40, right? And so what does that mean? And we have a lot of tools in our national security space for how to think about sectors where markets may not be competitive, how to make those competitive. So I think we want to tap into that. Another part of your question is, how much do you have to plan, right? Do you need to have some master vision? How much can you sort of say, well, we know that we're going to need X amount. So the reality with a lot of the clean energy stuff is that I've met all these really brilliant modelers and these engineers who actually can tell us a lot about what we actually need. I was at this event, this conference on thinking about these issues, and I sat next to this economist from the French finance ministry, and her mantra the entire day is, I need X amount of heat pumps. She's like, this is how many I'm going to need to buy. This is how many we're going to need to make. But she knew how many it was because she knows how many buildings she's got in her country, right? So I think there needs to be some thinking. And we already do this for weapons of war. The national security apparatus, the DoD, has tools to be thinking about this. But again, you want to use markets. We are a continent spanning economy, and we used to, or maybe we still have an agreement with, Canada and Mexico. There's a lot of scope here to think about using markets in ways that can be really functional, but we also know what we need to change. And the exciting thing about this moment, this conversation would have been very different 10 years ago and very different 20 years ago. But now I feel confident, and not as an energy expert, but I spent enough time with them to know that a lot of the technologies that we need are commercial. They are or can be commercially viable. That another world is possible, and we know how to at least make that version 1.0 of that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Heather.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, nice to see you. And thank you for this. And I think the basic point about thinking about how clean energy investments affect communities is really important. I get that. I want to push back on you on two very closely related points. One is something you just said about, well, we don't have a lot of time.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's a false um, myth about I guess all myths are false, but um, there's a myth about timescale coming from the environment community, mostly the far left, that somehow we have to do this in 10 years. And the truth is, we're not going to do it in 10 years. And that first slide you showed about the different choices, you said we can do one, we can invest in fossil fuels, or two, we can invest in fossil energy. I think that's a completely false dichotomy. President Obama did not do that, right? Shale gas boomed during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
And by the way, most of you brought up the coal jobs. Coal employment peaked in 1923 and coal production peaked in 2008. Coal jobs is kind of a marginal red herring. It's oil and gas jobs. It's not coal jobs. And so, I know coal became a big thing in the Clinton campaign and all of that, but the truth is, it's about oil and gas. And to me, this false dichotomy of somehow we can either invest in fossil fuels or invest in clean energy, I just think that's wrong. Yes, a lot of academics, some people sitting here in the room would love to see, and I'm one of them, would love to see a price on carbon. But the truth is, politically, a price on carbon does hurt fossil fuels potentially. And we're going to be using oil and gas, not coal, but oil and gas for a very long time. And so I think setting it up as this dichotomy and thinking that the transition has to be in 10 years means you end up creating policies that frankly are trying to make commercial things that are not yet commercial. I mean, example is hydrogen in the, IRA. And so I think your basic point about communities is great, but I think this framing of this dichotomy between clean energy versus fossil fuels is a mistake because we're just not there yet. I'd love to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, well, so part of my reaction is going to be I'm not the environmental scientist, so my understanding of a lot of the that we let me actually rephrase that. So my understanding is that the consequences of climate change are real and are pressing. So there is urgent, no matter how you slice it, we have urgency, right? Um, whether it's 10 years or 20 years, I am not the expert on knowing exactly when that moment is, but I'm watching every day the planet change. And that does, that affects me as a human, as a person, right? No matter what anybody, like, right, you see these things happening and you're like, wow, this isn't normal. And how are we going to get that back? And we know that there's tipping points. So I think that, and I don't think that I'm alone, that there's some anxiety around that. So okay, so that's like one, but I don't know about the time. Yes, and I mean, I think that there's nothing that I said that we needed to not do fossil fuels. I mean, my focus was on how we need to invest in the clean. And I think that the piece there, though, that's really important is the systems, that these are energy systems and that there's path dependencies built into them. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot that I want to know a lot more about is how much of a handle, and I think this actually gets to Joe's questions, how much of a handle do we have on where all of the big fossil-based capital investments are? When are they turning over naturally? And do we have a handle on how we can use policy to push at all of those levers when any of those things happen? So for example, when I was in the White House, my colleague, my brilliant colleague, Sue Helper, worked with a number of people to put together a 97-part slide deck on how the US auto industry could transition to how quickly they could transition to electric vehicles just using their current rate of turnover of capital equipment. And that's how we came up with the number that we could reach this 50% threshold by 2030 was actually looking at the data and saying, actually, well, this company's got to, do their revamp. They do their revamping every 5 years. So we're going to encourage them to, right? So you're using these natural shifts in technology to actually encourage each of those new paths to go clean. that feels to me like a really smart way to think about it, and kind of gets out of what you're saying. Because I think that the problem in the yes to all the things and, oh, we're never, oh yeah, well, it's not here, is that no, it's not here now. We need to help make it here. So I take issue with that. I think a part of the Tesla example is like, we can't rely only on very outlier examples to create new industries. That's not a policy strategy. That's too much is left to chance. So how do we as policymakers push that? And we have to help solve these market failures. Otherwise, it's not going to happen on its own. It'll take 100 years. And that gets back to my climate anxiety point. 100 years is too long. Maybe 10 years is too short. But my job is to make sure I don't have that job anymore. I'm an academic now. I got no job, right? I'm not like, I'm just talking to you. This is great. But our job as those advising policymakers is to make sure that we are taking care of our societies. And so we can't take risks that are irresponsible. And you're right, we can't move so fast that we break everything, but we can figure out how to create new path dependencies that push in the right direction. And we should be doing that at every single step that we can and not leaving that to chance. And that gets to the planning.
Thank you so much. This was really insightful, and I couldn't agree with you more. I'm from Ethiopia, from the African context, and we have a lot of challenges where, especially now that the Trump administration is in place, there are a lot of countries that were kind of pro fossil fuel that seem more emboldened to do that. Kind of, negating the fact that we are moving to a green future and how we really have to capitalize on that. I was just interested to see, maybe it's a difficult question, but so how do you see navigating kind of the political issues that you're facing now with the Trump administration scaling back on a lot of, the IRA? We've seen what it has been able to achieve, and it's really sad that you're not doubling down in that respect. And especially now with the political environment, it's going to be really difficult. But voices such as yours that are very pro clean energy, how do you see navigating the space? Let's say if the Trump administration, the Republicans win again, and for the next 8 years, you're going to have this political environment, but you can't cede control to other countries that are obviously capitalizing on this, the Chinas, etc. But this really is really instrumental to your national security, energy security. So how do you see navigating that space and dealing with what is possible to really make this a reality?
I mean, I think that the whole time, I always thought of this as a national security issue. I mean, it just seems so clearly, abundantly clear to me that if you don't have access to cheap energy, you can't be the kind of economy that I have the hopes and dreams that the U.S. can be. I think that the competition with China should be putting some fire under our feet to act. And I think it is. I think that. I mean, again, as I visited with people in places around the country, they're seeing that competition and they're taking action. There's a lot that the private sector has done, is done, will continue to do. So, the federal government plays a particular role. But again, once these things get moving, they have their own path dependency. So yeah, I don't know if I have any other answer for you. I mean, you kind of answered your question. Your question provided its answer, so that was actually quite easy. But I do think that thinking about this as a global competition issue, and the more pressure, quite frankly, that other countries are putting on us to continue to move in a clean energy direction, the harder it will be for us to ignore that. So I kind of am crossing my fingers and hoping that the rest of the world, I won't be going to COP this year, but I am watching closely. What are they doing? Hopefully the rest of the world says, actually, we can't allow this to continue. And continues to put that pressure, because that's where the competitive economic pressure is going to come from.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Former Secretary Raimondo was here last week speaking about industrial policy, and I got the sense that she pushed back on some of the investment into manufacturing in the US, where we could also diversify our supply chains to kind of reduce this monopoly by, for example, China. How do you see the balance between the how and what we make in the US with what can we get from our friendly allies?
Yeah, so a great question. And a super important one, right? I don't mean to imply that we should make everything here. That's ridiculous. But there's a, there's a range, right, under which like it's too much or too little. Where's that middle ground? I don't know. You kind of know it when you see it. One of the things that I think proved challenging during the Biden years, and I think we haven't found the right answers to, is, and so with the local economic development angle with REC Silicon, one of the things that I wanted to elevate is that their strategy was connected to what the national vision is, right? They were able to go, oh, the federal government is providing support for moving in this direction. Well, we can get into that supply chain and we can do that, but we need national help. We need tariff policy that works for us. We need grant, we need tax, but we need these other policies that work to make that possible. It's the same on the international side, right? Where countries, like as you figure out what you're trying to do, other countries should be able to figure out how to find their place in that global supply chain. And that's the work that the National Security Council should be doing, that the State Department should be doing. How can you help countries be able to find their place and find their own economic development strategy within this new, larger clean energy supply chain that's developing? I think that one of the most exciting things about clean energy is that it can be a local economic development strategy for so many different places in ways that fossil fuel energy just can't. And that can provide a lot of opportunity for developing countries to be able to, if they can figure out how to become a part of that supply chain and make things in their own country, that can give them access to autonomy and economic independence that they don't have now. That feels very exciting. And I hope more people who work on those fields are thinking about that. It also could be very exciting once you get some of these technologies that you can reuse the minerals in them. So you actually then you're really not tied to that place-based aspect. So, but that all requires some coordination, and not like coordination all caps, like just like a little italicized coordination, like some conversations that help you know, oh yeah, we want to do this. Okay, we want to do this. That is supposed to be what diplomacy is about, and what our global trade policy should be about. And we should be thinking about using the institutions we have to have those conversations, just like we should be using those institutions domestically to have those conversations.
We have time for one more quick question.
Thank you very much. I'm a European observer, political science professor from France. You mentioned our finance minister and the long-time perspective they had. My question is, since to rebound on the local, opportunities and the solid aspect of your argument, according to the second question, what do you see as possible transatlantic cooperation between Europe and the US right now? Or what is the part of the federated states that they can play and could play with either European regions or municipalities and that kind of ideas? I'm, exploring what we could do together, but it's less and less clear.
It's probably with civil society in terms of transatlantic at this point on clean energy issues. I mean, I think this is a challenging moment to talk about that, just given where the current administration is. And I haven't spent, I don't know if anybody else in the room is, I haven't spent any time talking to the former folks that I spent a lot of time with during the Biden years at the OECD or other institutions where those kinds of conversations could be had. My guess is that the US is not playing a big role at this point in time. But I think that, part of it is continuing to keep that pressure on and to know that there are millions of actors here in the United States who haven't given up on this vision, and that does, across the country. And so where to find those local partnerships. But other than that, I don't have any good suggestions. Sorry.
Okay, so before we wrap up, let me know we'll meet again at noon next Monday. We'll be hosting Al McGartland for a conversation. Al is going to reflect on U.S. environmental policy. He has recently stepped down as director of the National Center for Environmental Economics at EPA. And finally, please join me in thanking Heather Boushey for her remarks today. Thank you so much, Heather. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.